The weekly Cybercrime and Business Podcast is brought to you by SurfWatch Labs. SurfWatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact to their business, and proactively address threats head-on. Hey everybody out there, today is April 10th, 2015. I am Jeff Peters, HackSurfer editor. I'm here with Matt Lightfist, HackSurfer writer, and Michael Thel, SurfWatch Labs data analyst. A little bit later, after our discussion and the latest cybercrime news, we'll be chatting with IBM senior cyber threat researcher John Kuhn. We talk about the Dyre Wolf Campaign, where they said that in recent incidents, organizations have lost between $500,000 and $1.5 million to attackers, and IBM security research shows that the Dyre malware infection rate continues to increase. So we chat about that. But yeah, jump right into it. Throw it over to you, Matt, for the top stories of the week.
Coming in at number 3 this week, and this is keeping in mind, we'll talk about this a little bit later, guys. We had OpIsrael this week, and there are several targets that came out for that. But like I said, we'll get into a group discussion about that later. Taking that out of the equation, coming in number 3 this week was the University of California, Riverside. And this is yet another university attack, and we've seen this trending all year so far in 2015. The university notified about 8,000 people that their personal information may have been compromised after a desktop computer was stolen on March 13th, so earlier this year. They just reported the breach. The people affected by this were graduate students and graduate school applicants to the school. And a spokeswoman, the reason behind the tardiness in reporting about this breach is a spokesperson said that the university needed to make sure that they knew who was affected. Coming in at number 2 this week, we had Linux Australia. Delegates for Linux Australia conferences, as well as PyCon, had their information exposed after a data breach. Linux Australia notified all the delegates through an email. The company held delegate information from the 2013, 2014, and the most recent conference event that was held in Auckland. Linux Australia said the breach was the result of an unknown vulnerability, and they have asked computer emergency response teams to help identify the unknown vulnerability. At number 1 this week, we had Big B Coffee. It was reported earlier this week that they had been breached. The people affected were registrants for frequent customer cards and applicants through the company's corporate website. They were the ones that were potentially compromised. At this time, it's not known how many people were affected, but the company's estimating it was less than 20% of their registered customers. And then getting back into it, guys, what I said, we had a lot of hacktivist activity this week. In SurfWatch Labs data, there were multiple targets from OpIsrael that were showing up everywhere. It was several areas were showing up, several targets. Might be a good place to start the conversation this week.
Yeah, so OpIsrael has been going on for the past couple of years. I think the consensus, at least from the articles I've read, even some of them ones written more by the attackers themselves, is that it's not really up to the same level as it was. I think in 2013 there was some ridiculous claims it was like $3 billion worth of damage, which I'm pretty sure is an inflated number, but still, I mean, they were estimating it much higher a couple years ago. Just quick highlights of like some of the things that were attacked. Hundreds of websites were defaced. Some of the victims included like Israeli political parties, Israeli companies, subdomains of higher education institutions, municipalities, Israeli artists, things like that. Tens of thousands of email addresses and personal information of Israelis was leaked, but they believe that some of that was recycled from previous campaigns. A lot of times they just kind of take old stuff and kind of re-release it, kind of like a greatest hits. And then there was a publication of details of dozens of credit cards, but some of those are recycled as well. So it seems to be mainly defacements and stuff that have happened so far this year.
Additionally, the primary actor behind these defacements was the Non-Ghost, a historically pro-Palestinian hacktivist organization with loose affiliations with Anonymous. And given the background of all these hacktivist campaigns. It's more ad hoc, where it was based on individuals, so you really can't point to one. You can point to the non-ghost threat actor for kind of drumming up the publicity for it, but you really can't, in theory, just blame the whole anonymous umbrella as a group, since they're not really a group.
Yeah, and it seemed like some of the articles I was reading, were sort of quoting some of the chats on IRC and stuff between the groups, and it seemed like they had a little more trouble sort of drumming up that support this year. Seems like it's kind of, although, a few hundred websites were defaced and stuff, obviously there was still some damage. It just seems like, well, the Israeli media, it's always kind of funny sort of watching the battle between those, because the Israeli media basically said it was a complete failure, and then you got the hacktivists who are saying they're going to perform an electronic holocaust, so it's kind of like a polar opposites. So it's kind of interesting seeing the two different viewpoints. But yeah, I think it was pretty much, pretty low level stuff that happened. There was also other hacktivist stuff in the news. I know last week we talked a little bit about some of the ISIS defacements that were going on. But as always, that stuff continues. I don't know, Mike, if you want to sort of fill us in on some new stuff that happened this week.
Yeah, some big news out of Europe this week. Sympathizers for the ISIS group attacked a French television channel, knocking it off air for a certain amount of time. It was actually the Cyber Caliphate hacktivist organization, and they used a form of malware. They leveraged a Java vulnerability to deliver a malicious script that allowed them to take control of infected devices, which is interesting. That news came out today in an article in Security Affairs. In addition, the hacktivists, at par for the course, defaced the Facebook page of the television channel TV5 Monde and posted photo ID cards of relatives of French soldiers involved in, and I quote, anti-ISIS operations, unquote. The network had to shut down broadcasting across its 11 channels for several hours and eventually resume limited transmission of pre-recorded programs. I believe it was just 2 or 3 hours they were knocked off the air. But this is an interesting new development in this sort of ISIS sympathizer hacktivism that we've started seeing. Most of it, as we've noted in previous podcasts, has just been really simple defacements and stuff, but this seems like a very advanced sort of attack, and whether that's a sign of things to come, we really don't know, but based off of this one attack, it seems like their capabilities are starting to get a little more complex.
Concerning Cyber Caliphate, I'm pretty sure we've seen them before in the news. What do we know about them so far? Obviously they're a hacktivist group. It seems like they're sympathetic to ISIS, and they kind of support them, at least from what I remember. Do we know what their true goals are or anything like that?
They've done the Malaysian Airlines. They hijacked some social media accounts. So from my basic reading, and this requires further research, they've really just done account hijacking, a lot of defacements, and account hijacking of social media specifically. So I think that the use of malware is probably their first sort of advanced attack, you can say. They're not persistent, given that this is probably a one-off, depending on how you define persistent. This is probably a sign that they've either developed sort of advanced capabilities, or they're stealing. They probably have hackers or criminals now that are sympathetic, that are helping the group out as a whole. So that's a new development.
Yeah, and I think for the most part, most of these ISIS kind of related hacktivist activities, although the FBI says that they're pretty confident they're not really perpetrated by ISIS, they've been pretty low level. And I know the FBI released a warning this week. They basically said that the common thread is these WordPress vulnerabilities, like we talked about last week. And they said, although the defacements demonstrate low-level hacking sophistication, they are disruptive and often costly, just in terms of lost business revenue or expenditures on technical services to repair infected systems. So yeah, this new development is kind of interesting, because it seems the consensus among everyone is really that most of these have been pretty low level. So it's kind of interesting if some of these groups sympathetic to the Islamic State are kind of maybe upping their game a little bit. That was kind of the big story of this week. There's just been a lot of this hacktivist activity. Are there any other big stories this week that stood out to you guys?
There's one story that stood out to me. It was the alleged Russian breach of the White House unclassified computer systems. Reports came out this week that Russian hackers were able to breach the White House's unclassified security systems. And they did this, interestingly enough, by leveraging a hijacked State Department email account and spearfishing an individual at the White House. Even though they did not have access to classified systems, they were able to obtain information that was not classified but was sensitive. So one example that was thrown around in the media was like details of the president's schedule. So I think this is an interesting development where, previously they did mention something about a breach a while ago, but it's interesting how these persistent individuals or groups have been able to embed themselves in government systems and leverage that access to try to compromise other systems.
Yeah, and this CNN story that I think kind of started it all, it says that despite the efforts to lock them out, the Russian hackers have been able to re-enter the system. And one official says that the Russian hackers have owned the State Department for months. The official didn't really elaborate on what the word owned means, so everyone's kind of been speculating.
What's interesting about that point is that the State Department has been trying to get these people out of their email system for the longest time and have at points shut down their parts, if not their whole email system over weekends to try to root out these hackers. But it seems that it wasn't quite successful, or it's still ongoing.
Yeah, so moving on, we have our cyber tip of the week. There was a new study that was released from KnowBe4 and Osterman Research. It said that nearly 80% of those polled say that they've seen no improvement in the ways that they proactively approach phishing. And in fact, 1/3 see the problem actively worsening. And I thought that was interesting because coming up in the interview with John Kuhn, the IBM senior cyber threat researcher, the campaign that's been stealing between 500,000 and 1.5 million from these businesses is basically uses a lot of social engineering and phishing. The KnowBe4 CEO, he said that with 122 billion emails being sent every hour, opportunities for phishing or spear phishing abound. And it's become easier than ever to gather personal information and use this to tailor a spear phishing email to a CEO or finance executive and use it to pilfer millions of dollars just using email. Effective security awareness training can mitigate this risk. But obviously, as that study shows, 1/3 are actually seeing the problem getting worse. So just something you can say again and again and again, but obviously got to teach your employees about phishing. But yeah, that's it for this week's discussion. Coming up, we have that interview with John Kuhn. He is the IBM senior threat researcher, and we talk about the Dyre Wolf Campaign. I know last week you guys put out a blog post on the Dyre Wolf malware, which stole more than $1 million from targeted organizations. Just wondering if you could give us maybe a little background on how that attack worked and what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Dyre malware came out around mid-2014. I mean, the malware aspect of it isn't necessarily new, but what's going on with this group that maintains and uses Dyre malware is your sophistication has gotten significantly more troubling for organizations. So Dyre malware came out around 2014 last year, and it slowly progressed in its capabilities and its technology. It added mass spear phishing or mass spam emails that it was sending out. Essentially, once you're infected through email, it turns around and sends all the emails to your address book out and tries to infect as many people as possible. Kind of old school techniques, but super effective, because in October last year, we've seen a significant increase. We're talking, from a few hundreds tracked by our IBM Trusteer company to up into the 4,000, 5,000s range within 1 month after releasing that update. So they've continually started to progress Dyre, but what happened about a month ago or so is they've added a completely new complexity to their campaign. So a lot of these banking organizations, they have two-factor authentication methods in order to wire off or move large sums of money. We're talking over $1 million at a time to offshore bank accounts. And in order to be able to do that, organizations need a two-factor authentication code. We're all very familiar with those. But the Dyre Malware group needs those. So what they do is, as someone that's infected goes to a banking website or goes to their banking website, logs in, it instantly kicks back a message saying that there was a trouble. There's been some kind of error logging in. You need to call this number. That's the first point of the deception and kind of the first point of this newer campaign style that they're doing. Because this number they solely control. They have a call center on the other side of that. Someone is waiting for you. They've obviously known that you've tried to attempt to log into this bank. It probably shows them what bank you tried to attempt to log into so that when you call this number and you try to correct the error that's been displayed to you, they answer with your bank. So nothing sets off too many alarms at that point. They answer with your bank, and what they try to do is social engineer your two-factor authentication codes out. What they want you to do is simply tell them your login codes. And once you've done that, once you've gone that far and told them, well, they log into the bank as you and wire off this huge sums of money. We're talking 500,000 on some instances. We're talking over $1 million on other instances. So the social engineering aspect of it right there, not really heard of before in these banking Trojans. And stealing that large sum of money, not really heard of with banking Trojans in the past either. So it's just at that point, once the wire transfer happens and they effectively move the large sum of money out of your account, they have to somehow distract you, right? I mean, They need to move that to several other accounts because the reversal can happen. If $1 million leaves your account, you can call your bank and have that reversed really quickly. But as time progresses and they keep moving it from account to account to account further away from the original transaction, it becomes incredibly difficult for banks to reverse that. And that's what they're trying to do. So they stall you with another unheard of kind of tactic when it comes to banking Trojans, which is the DDoS. They use a large-scale, volumetric, NTP, DNS-based DDoS attack and just swamp you. In the instances that we've been tracking, they focused on the website of the organization that they attacked. Seems like just as a distraction mechanism, but they also can attack your network itself. I mean, they can attack your gateway devices. They can slow it down to the point you might not even be able to log into your bank efficiently to even notice that something like that has happened. So that's definitely the newer tactics and why we redubbed it the Dyre Wolf, because they're super aggressive, super sophisticated. They've definitely grown in their capabilities and really aggressive on stealing that amount of money from individual organizations.
Yeah, I'm just curious how many businesses have been targeted by this, and kind of how widespread this attack is.
We're tracking in Trustdeer over 4,000 investigations. As many companies have been affected, can vary through the industries. And again, it's not really attacking any particular industries because it's using that widespread email campaign. It's just getting lucky at that point. It seems to be sort of organically spreading through industries. Because let's say you're part of one particular industry. Well, most of the contacts in your address book for your work PC is probably other people within the industry. So you're spreading it out to those contacts as well, too. So we do see a little bit of organic movement and growth between any particular industry, but they don't seem to be targeting. They just seem to be targeting individuals within your organization that handle the financial end of your business.
I'm wondering then, like with the two-factor authentication, is that something that you guys have not seen at all before? Is that pretty rare to see kind of this level of sophistication?
Yeah, completely new. I mean, the two-factor authentication bypass by using an actual person is kind of unheard of. I mean, I haven't heard of any other campaign that actually manned a call center in order to defeat two-factor authentication. I mean, they're simply going after the weakest link of the chain. They're going after people. They're social engineering people in order to get the information they want out.
Yeah, so I guess, if you're a business out there listening, what kind of advice is there? It seems like, obviously, the social engineering aspect is probably the most important, but is there anything else that they can do?
Highly training your staff, especially the ones dealing with your finances, about what to look for and what not to do. I mean, rule number one for anybody in any career is never give your password to anybody over the phone. Your bank's never going to ask for it. Your IT person's never going to ask for it. No one should ever ask for your password over the phone. And if someone does ask you for that password over the phone, that should be reported immediately. I'm always kind of under the guideline. If it looks and it feels suspicious, it's probably suspicious, right? So really training your staff on what to do and what not to do. And also, just because a number appears on the website erroneously or even, injected into the website of your bank, that doesn't mean necessarily you should call that number. You should always call the verified numbers that you have for your bank if any problems have come up.
Yeah, and then I'm wondering just to kind of get your thoughts on sort of the larger kind of malware scene. I'm assuming that you've probably dealt with a few different types of malware, so just wondering if there's any sort of trends besides this that stand out, or if you think like maybe with this particular attack, we might see more, attacks using sort of ways to circumvent two-factor, or if that's going to maybe be a rare thing going forward.
It's difficult to get around two-factor authentication unless they're has some deeper dive into the malware, or maybe they're capturing your email. Again, the easiest point that they could attack was definitely through the people, hacking the people or social engineering the people behind it is always the easiest step. I mean, there is aspects of the malware that are quite intriguing. One of them is it uses I2P, and if you're not familiar with I2P is kind of an equivalent of Tor or the dark web. Everybody calls it the dark net. So they're using I2P as a way to mask their command and control. It keeps them completely anonymous. It's peer-to-peer. It's very difficult to track down the command and control from an organizational standpoint. If you're monitoring your network devices, right, it just looks like I2P traffic, which may or may not be legitimate within your organization, but it's completely hidden under the radar. So it does do some aspects of it, and that's why I always suggest, like, we're monitoring samples coming in all the time through IBM. We're tracking them, the new samples of UpAtree, which is the downloader, right? The first thing that comes in is UpAtree, and its sole purpose is to just download Dyre and execute Dyre. So we're seeing rolling samples of this, and these guys are incredibly quick and changing the code of UpAtree and changing the code of Dyre to evade standard AV detection. I mean, they could release possibly up to 10 different variants of UpAtree and Dyre a day. So what I always suggest to organizations is, yes, you have your static AV, right? I mean, this traditional AV, if a malware happens, we write signature for that malware. I'm trying to get companies to open up to more behavioral type malware. It doesn't matter what kind of malware it is. What we really want to focus in on is the behavior of that malware once it's trying to infect your machine. We got to catch these UpAtrees downloading Dyre or UpAtrees hooking into registry entries that definitely should not be, and it's assigning itself a malicious service on your PC. It's these behavioral type of tactics that we need to get to. That way, it doesn't matter necessarily how what they do to hide it behind AV detection. We need to really start focusing on behavioral type detection. Absolutely.
And I guess I would assume that they're mainly targeting large organizations, where like $1 million wire transfer won't stand out as much. Is that true?
Absolutely. I think they get a good sense by logging into the bank website itself about how much they can take and how much they can keep it under the radar. And it seems to be in the large money grabs is where they're using the DDoS. They know they've taken a large sum of money that's probably going to get noticed eventually, if not immediately. So they start the DDoS process in order to lengthen that amount of time. Or your organization is wiring out millions of dollars, and that's just how your business runs. That's definitely going to be difficult, especially if your business automatically or does by default send large sums of money overseas, where their accounts lie too. So it becomes increasingly difficult, and they do seem to be targeting those organizations with larger money grabs.
It seems like the problem always tends to come back to phishing or spearfishing, and I think one of your guys' statistics was that 95% of breaches or cyber attacks involve some kind of human vector. I mean, obviously, everyone always says train your employees, but I mean, do you have any specific tips or advice on what they should do? Because it seems like year after year, this still remains kind of the big problem.
Yeah. So what I'd really like is training, interactive training, right? So there's those organizations out there that will spearfish you on your company's behalf, right? And they'll spearfish your entire staff. IBM does this to our own staff. And they'll send out an email that looks very deceptive, and what they're trying to do is see if their employees will click on it or not. And if they do click on it, they automatically get sent to training. They automatically get sent to a page where it says, you should not have clicked on this. This is why. This is what you should be looking for. Things like that. I mean, I think that's far more impactful than somebody sitting down and watching a video telling them not to do something, right? So I really like that interactive training. And as a return, the corporation gets statistics about how vulnerable are their staff to spearfishing. I've worked with a lot of organizations that maybe 60% of their staff clicked on that email, and then they reran the test maybe a month or two later, and that got reduced significantly down to maybe 10%. So I think that is really effective, this interactive type training.
Yeah, and then I guess my last question is just looking forward, for the rest of 2015, is there any just kind of cybercrime trends or anything in terms of malware that sort of sticks out in your mind?
I think this multifaceted type of attacks are definitely going to increase. I think that we've built our security posture up enough as individual organizations, but they're now having to take more brazen attacks and more brazen steps in order to accomplish their task. I mean, think about all the aspects of what this is doing. We have spearfishing, we have malware, we have the dark web, we have social engineering. And then we have DDoS on top of that. I mean, that's like textbook everything that you could possibly use in your toolkit in order to be able to successfully pull it off. I think attackers are growing in sophistication, malware is growing in sophistication, and individual organizations need to keep up in the bar themselves to be able to identify these types of attacks. Definitely far more sophistication is going to increase 2015, 2016.
That's it for this week's Cybercrime and Business Podcast. As always, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, YouTube, Podbean, or wherever else you listen. And for more information, check out hacksurfer.com and surfwatchlabs.com.